In the first two installments of this series, we talked about enhancing the live playing functionality of the Deliverance. And in this video, we're going to discuss the second subtle yet significant reason for updating the Series II to the II Plus.
All right, so to properly explain the second enhancement in the Series II, I'm going to have to take a slightly circuitous route, and I'm going to touch on a few different ideas. And the first one being a gentle reminder that Fryette has been at the forefront of power amp design and technology since the 1980s. You know, with the 2150, 290, 252, LX2, the power stations, and all the rest of the amplifiers, it's pretty obvious that they've been extremely passionate about how the power amp affects the overall playing experience from the very beginning. The second idea to hold in your mind is that the Deliverance was conceived to be the most straightforward and simple design as possible, while being able to get at any possible tone that you could dream of without a bunch of futzing around and feature fatigue, right? So just a streamlined and simple amplifier for people who like to plug straight in, ride their volume knob, and go. All right, and so this third idea to consider is sort of this newer paradigm that we've entered in the last decade, where some of these big old loud amplifiers that were relegated to storage and maybe man cave decoration are maybe getting a new lease on life with products like the Power Station coming to market. You know, even I did a video a couple years ago suggesting that with the Power Station, you can take some of these old amplifiers and re-examine them and see what they might be able to do for you in your tonal arsenal. Now that we have these tools that not only allow us to sound really good playing through them, but also be able to manage SPL and stay musical. All right, so to recap, three ideas we're combining. Number one, Fryette being super passionate about power amp design and how they influence the sound and feel of the amplifier as a whole. Two, the Deliverance being the most elegantly simplistic design of the Fryette big amp line. And then three, with the advent and possibilities that have been made practical by the Power Station becoming ubiquitous, Steve was really inspired to further refine and tweak the Deliverance's power section and how it interacted with the preamp to bring about the most dynamic and versatile iteration of this amp as possible.
And now, a few words about tone production from a historical perspective. Back in the early days of big rock and roll concertizing, companies like Fender, Vox, Marshall, and Hiwatt were tasked with creating guitar amps that could fill out the sound of large venues without the aid of adequate sound reinforcement. This was the beginning of the big iron era of amps, with more wattage, bigger cabs, and more power handling all the way around. Some guitarists of this era found that their favorite tones were only available when they cranked these types of amps up to ungodly volume levels. But that was the 60s and 70s, and everyone was high anyway, so they all accepted it as a fact of life. By the time the late 70s were rolling around, we saw master volume innovation starting to take shape, which put more emphasis on preamp saturation for gain, instead of needing to crank stuff up. And during that era, we saw many amplifier designs that more or less relegated the power section to cleanly managing the overall volume of whatever was happening in the preamp. Guitarists were able to get distortion at lower volume levels, and in many ways, it seemed that for the most part, cranking amps up to saturate the power section for a gainy sound was a relic of the past. But by the time the 90s arrived, there was a much bigger push in sound reinforcement to keep stage volumes lower and lower, so whoever was mixing sound at the venue could better control the mix in the house. The last thing they wanted to see was somebody hauling a big full stack of SPL death to the local watering hole. So these big iron amps were moved back even further on the bus as viable tools for the regular gigging musician.
So as often happens in life, and certainly in our little guitar culture, we eventually came back around and realized that, power amp saturation is actually a really good thing. And in fact, it imparts a completely different sonic and playing character than preamp gain does. And it's not that one is better than the other or anything silly like that. It's just that the character of preamp gain and power amp saturation are so different. And with tools like the Power Station and their ilk being everywhere these days, like, why wouldn't we take advantage of these tools and the knowledge, the accumulated knowledge of all this guitar tone chasing of the last 50 years? And that brings us back to the Series II Plus. This iteration is all about achieving maximum tonal and tactile interplay between all of the variations of knob twiddling possibilities that you can possibly come up with. And when coupled with an attenuator, you can do anything and everything with this amp. Now, you can get by without using an attenuator, but you're gonna have to pay the SPL piper on that one. But that's been the story of pushing big iron around since the beginning of time, right? So it's beyond the scope of this video to do a bunch of playing and tone tests. We're gonna have plenty of that content coming up, but for now I wanna leave you with 3 quick thoughts before we get out of here. The first one is anticipating people wondering if, having gain 2 zeroed out is, losing something from previous versions of the Deliverance. And Steve told me that, in fact, in the high gain modes, the more mode, that the amp actually has a little bit more gain than previous versions. So not only will you have that on tap, but you have all of this expanded clean and low gain capabilities in this version. So that's thought number 1. Point number 2, Deliverance is still going to be available in 60 and 120 watt versions, just like they always have. And finally, point number 3, the Series II Plus is even more impervious to power tube type variances than ever before. So should you find yourself in a pinch, you can throw damn near anything that you have in this amp and it will still sound like a Grail. So hopefully this lends a little bit of clarity to some subtle refinements that are a bit harder to discuss than obvious stuff like, hey, we added an EQ or onboard effects or something like that. The proof is in the pudding though, we hope you're able to sit down in front of one of these and get to play it yourself soon. But until then, we have a lot more Deliverance content coming up, and we hope you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.